Miss Marple notices a charming stranger in the village whose crooked smile hides more than warmth. When a local is found dead after a brief encounter with him, whispers of deceit spread quickly. Now, Miss Marple must unravel the truth before the stranger's smile claims another victim. Chapter 1. Tea in the vicarage garden. It was one of those golden St. Mary Mead afternoons, when time seemed to hesitate. The vicarage garden, polished and blooming, played host to Reverend Clement's summer tea, a modest, respectable event with china teacups, lace napkins, and small talk disguised as conversation. The hedges had been clipped with military precision, and a breeze drifted lazily through the tall hollyhocks, stirring the edges of tablecloths and carrying the scent of scones and lavender. Miss Marple sat beneath the shade of a hawthorn tree, her delicate hands folded around a floral cup of Earl Grey. She was dressed in her customary soft tones gray cardigan, straw hat pinned with violets, and gloves tucked neatly in her handbag. Her eyes, though softened by age, missed nothing. The vicar's tea was, after all, more than just a pleasant village custom. It was a window into character, and St. Mary Mead was a village where character was everything. "Have you heard about the new man at Little Hollows?" asked Mrs. Bantry, who had shuffled her chair closer with the urgency of a secret to be shared. Miss Marple looked up mildly. "No, dear. I didn't know it had been let." "Oh yes, just recently. A Mr. Hargreaves, moved in all on his own. Seems scholarly, keeps to himself, reads a lot, hardly speaks to anyone. But there's something odd about him." "Odd?" Miss Marple inquired, stirring her tea. Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "He smiles but not properly. It's skewed, somehow, as if half his face isn't quite in agreement with the other." Miss Marple gave a polite little nod. "People do sometimes smile that way when they've suffered a stroke." "Yes, well, perhaps," said Mrs. Bantry, "but I don't think that's it. It's not illness, it's more like a secret, if you ask me." At that moment, Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been pretending not to listen, leaned across the table. "I saw him just the other day, outside the grocer's. That same smile, like a grimace that had forgotten how to be friendly. And he wears a dark coat even when it's hot. Gives me the shivers." Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver, but her mind began knitting together the thread of details. In her long life, she had often found that such seemingly minor things, a coat out of season, a hesitant smile, meant far more than anyone supposed. "He walks the same path every morning," added Mrs. Bantry. "North Lane, just beyond the wood. No dog, no stick, not even a newspaper. Just walking, like he's waiting for something." Miss Marple, without comment, turned her attention momentarily to the tea table. A fresh plate of scones had been brought out by the vicar's wife, and a few guests fussed over whether there was still enough clotted cream. The mood remained cheerful, gossip woven with cake crumbs, laughter softened by the polite clink of teaspoons. But then, the peace shattered. A scream, sudden, high, human. It came from beyond the far hedge, somewhere in the direction of Little Hollows. The sound split the garden in half. Conversations froze. Cups were set down. The breeze, moments ago so gentle, now seemed to hush in respect. "Good heavens," Reverend Clement murmured, already rising to his feet. "That was someone's in trouble. I think it came from the woods," said Major Fairbanks, squinting into the distance, without waiting for permission. Several of the younger men set off toward the gate. The vicar followed, his hat in one hand, concern etched across his kindly face. Miss Marple didn't move. Her fingers rested on the handle of her teacup, her eyes fixed now on the far end of the lane. It wasn't the scream alone that troubled her, it was the silence that followed it. That thick, unnatural quiet that always arrives just after something irrevocable has occurred. Mrs. Bantry sat frozen beside her. "Do you think it could be him?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She was thinking of the man with the crooked smile, a face she had not yet seen, but could already picture, 15 minutes passed long and strained. Conversation stumbled and stopped. No one reached for a second helping of cake. Then the search party returned, slower, heads bowed slightly. Reverend Clement removed his hat as he stepped back onto the lawn. "I must ask everyone to remain calm," he said, voice steady but tight. "There's been an incident. Mr. Hargreaves has been found dead. The police have been sent for." A collective gasp followed, a chorus of shock muffled by disbelief. Mrs. Price Ridley pressed her hand to her chest. Mrs. Bantry whispered something about calling her husband. Teacups were hastily abandoned. Was it an accident? Someone asked. Reverend Clement hesitated. "It's too early to say," which, in St. Mary Mead, was a polite way of saying no. As the guests quietly gathered their belongings and trickled out. The buzz of low conversation returned, but it was no longer about jam competitions or flower arrangements. It was theories now, layered with unease. Each villager rehearsed their last sighting of Mr. Hargreaves, each one certain it had meant more than it had at the time. That Miss Marple stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. She walked toward the garden gate and paused. The sky was still clear, the birds still sang, and the wind still rustled through the trees, but something had changed. A shadow had entered the village. She looked once more toward the path that led behind the woods. The same path the stranger with the crooked smile had taken each morning, faithfully and alone. "Curious," she said to no one in particular. "Very curious." Then, with measured steps, she turned and made her way home. Already, in the quiet theater of her mind, a dozen small observations were lining themselves up, each innocuous, each perfectly ordinary except, of course, when they weren't. Chapter 2. The village begins to whisper. The following morning, the news had not only spread, it had grown. In St. Mary Mead, a whisper had a curious way of turning into a theory, and a theory once repeated over tea and scones soon took on the weight of fact. Mr. Hargreaves was dead, and the village, though outwardly shocked, began to revel in the deep-seated pleasure of speculation. At the high street grocer's, Mrs. Petherbridge announced solemnly, "The constable found him with his walking stick snapped clean in two. That doesn't happen unless someone wants it to happen. He didn't carry a stick," replied Mr. Simmons, the butcher, who had never spoken to Mr. Hargreaves but felt entitled to weigh in. "He walked with his hands behind his back, like a schoolmaster or a man who's got secrets." "Exactly," said Mrs. Petherbridge triumphantly, ignoring the contradiction. "A secretive man is twice as likely to end up murdered. I read that in Woman's Mirror, up the road, at the post office." Miss Hartnell had a different version. "It was a robbery," she insisted. "Has to be. These sorts of quiet men always have something valuable tucked away. Silver teaspoons or war medals. Someone from outside, no doubt. A vagrant." Miss Marple, who happened to be purchasing stamps at the time, folded the corners of her envelope with careful precision. "It's interesting," she murmured, "how rarely robberies occur without anything being taken." Miss Hartnell frowned. "Well, the police haven't told us what was missing, have they?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "But one notices these things." She left without another word, her straw hat bobbing gently as she walked up the lane. She had no intention of interfering, not publicly, but she knew already that the real story was not being discussed in any shop, and not over any garden fence. It was hidden behind lowered eyes, nervous glances, and the peculiar silence of people who suddenly remembered the last thing they said to a man who was now dead. By mid-afternoon, Constable Graves had stationed himself outside the gate of Little Hollows. The house stood dark and shuttered, its ivy trailing like limp fingers over the windowsills. A thin strip of police tape cordoned off the side path that led to the woods. Mrs. Bantry stood on the edge of the road, craning her neck as if hoping to glimpse a clue lying casually on the grass. They say his body was found just at the edge of the clearing, she told Miss Marple, who had appeared beside her almost without notice. Face down. No blood, but a nasty bruise on the back of the head. Do you know who discovered him? Asked Miss Marple gently. Reverend Clement. Poor man. He and young Tom Davis went ahead of the others. He said it looked like Hargreaves had simply dropped. No struggle, no signs of a fight, no scratches, torn sleeves, none, which is odd, if you ask me. Miss Marple made a small, thoughtful sound. People rarely die in woodland without leaving a mark of their last moment. Trees are not gentle companions. Mrs. Bantry glanced at her. You don't think it was natural, do you? Miss Marple looked out toward the trees. Natural deaths rarely inspire screams, my dear. The two women stood in silence a while longer. Somewhere down the lane, a dog barked. The church bell chimed the hour. Life, it seemed, was resuming its rhythm, except it wasn't. Not quite. That evening, Reverend Clement visited Miss Marple's cottage. He looked tired, as if he'd aged several months in a single day. She received him with her usual quiet hospitality, tea to shortbread biscuits, and the kind of silence that encourages confidences. I suppose I'm meant to deliver a sermon on forgiveness this Sunday, he said, accepting the tea. But I don't feel particularly forgiving at the moment. You were the one who found him? Yes, Tom Davis and I told the others to stay behind. Something in that scream didn't feel ordinary, or no, it wouldn't. He stared into his teacup. He looked peaceful. That was the strange part. There was no fear on his face, just stillness. His hands were folded beneath him. But the bruise on his head, it was very deliberate. A blow, one precise strike. From the front? No, from behind. Miss Marple nodded, as if this confirmed something. I didn't know him well. Reverend Clement went on. He came to church only once. Sat at the back, didn't speak to anyone. But there was something terribly lonely about him. I remember thinking he looked like a man who was already half in mourning. Miss Marple set down her cup. Did he speak to you at all? Only to thank me for the sermon. I'd spoken on reconciliation. I remember now because it seemed to affect him more than most. Interesting, she murmured. The vicar looked up. You think it means something? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Everything means something, Reverend. The challenge lies in understanding what, especially in a village like ours. The next day brought the arrival of Detective Inspector Cray, a large man with blunt features and a manner that suggested impatience. With anything not written in ink, he interviewed everyone thoroughly. But it was clear he viewed the case as a simple matter of assault, possibly robbery, possibly revenge. Miss Marple, however, watched the inspector carefully. She noted the questions he didn't ask, how little he seemed interested in the when and the why of Hargreaves's daily walks, how he never asked about Hargreaves's past, or what had brought him to a village like St. Mary Mead in the first place. Because in Miss Marple's experience, murder did not begin with the moment of death. It began months, sometimes years before, with a decision, or a secret, or a smile that never quite reached both corners of the mouth. By evening, the village had returned to its routines on the surface, but under that placid layer, something stirred. Questions, memories, regrets. At twilight, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, her lace curtains drawn back just enough to glimpse the quiet street outside. She dipped her pen in ink and began a list, not of suspects, no, that would come later. This list was simpler. Who saw Mr. Hargreaves last? Who knew him before he arrived? Who had reason to dislike a quiet, observant man? Who pretended not to notice him? As she wrote, she thought of the stranger's smile again. Crooked, yes, but not just from disuse. A smile that knew more than it said. A smile that might have seen something it shouldn't have. And that, in St. Mary Mead, could be dangerous indeed. Chapter 3. A visitor from the past. Days after the body of Mr. Hargreaves was found in the woods, beyond Little Hollows, The village of St. Mary Mead tried, with poor success, to restore its sense of equilibrium. The teacups still clinked, the church bells still rang, and Mrs. Petherbridge still placed her milk bottles out at exactly 7:15. But the rhythm had shifted. There was a hollow at the center of things now, like a missing stitch in otherwise perfect lacework. Miss Marple, for her part, did not seek out gossip. She let it come to her. That morning, it came in the form of Miss Ellie Reed, a young woman who taught at the nearby primary school and had a talent for acquiring information without appearing to do so. She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage under the pretense of delivering a jar of blackberry preserves, and within 5 minutes had settled into the armchair opposite the fireplace. "It's the oddest thing," Ellie said, stirring her tea without drinking it. "I was talking to Mr. Tyler, who manages the train station. He says a woman came asking about Mr. Hargreaves 3 days before the murder." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Did she leave a name?" "No, but she was smartly dressed. Gloves, travel case. Tyler said she didn't seem upset exactly, but anxious. Kept glancing toward the road as if expecting someone to follow her." "Did she meet Mr. Hargreaves?" "That's the strange part. Tyler says she bought a return ticket to London and left on the afternoon train same day she arrived. No sign she ever saw him." Miss Marple considered this. "And no one recognized her?" "No, but the postmistress said something curious. She remembered the woman asking if Hargreaves had Chang at his name recently." Now that was interesting. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Did she say what name she knew him by?" Ellie shook her head. "Only that she was looking for a man who once lived in Devon, about 20 years ago. Tall, reserved, with a birthmark on his left temple. She said if she found him, there might finally be some peace, and now he is dead." Miss Marple murmured, "Yes, which makes me wonder, was she warning him or confronting him?" Ellie finished her tea and departed soon after, leaving Miss Marple to her knitting and her thoughts. Outside the window, the sky was gray, and the trees along the lane rustled with the suggestion of a coming storm. Later that afternoon, a second visitor arrived, not to Miss Marple's cottage, but to Little Hollows. Constable Graves, who had been standing a dull sort of vigil outside the gate, noted her immediately. She stepped from a black motor car with quiet elegance, dressed in a dove-gray coat and matching hat, her eyes hidden behind dark-rimmed spectacles. She said her name was Mrs. Lydia Arkwell, and she had come to identify the deceased, Inspector Cray. Someone from his temporary post at the village hall took her inside. Miss Marple, passing at a distance on her walk, did not linger, but she observed the car's license plate, the wear on the lady's boots, and the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her bag later. Word drifted from the constable that Mrs. Arkwell had known Mr. Hargreaves many years ago. Though she declined to give details, she confirmed he had once lived under another name, Philip Jameson, and that he had left London abruptly in 1928, following the collapse of a personal matter. A phrase like that in St. Mary Mead was an open invitation to speculation. Mrs. Bantry wasted no time. A personal matter? That could mean anything: a love affair, a lawsuit, even something criminal. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "Mark my words, it was a woman. It always is. Why else change your name and disappear into a village like this?" "He did seem like a man hiding from something," murmured Ellie Reed, who had rejoined the discussion with the ease of someone who had never left. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray was not nearly so enchanted with the romantic possibilities. He considered Mrs. Arkwell's story vague and possibly manipulative. People with old grudges are always the first to show up once the danger's past. He remarked dryly to Constable Graves, "She says she was trying to make peace. I say she came to finish something she couldn't 30 years ago." But Miss Marple found herself wondering differently. The woman hadn't stayed. After identifying the body and answering a few questions, Mrs. Arkwell had promptly departed on the next train. She left no forwarding address, merely stating that she had no wish to intrude further. To Miss Marple, this wasn't the behavior of someone hiding guilt, it was the behavior of someone closing a chapter. That night, alone with her notebook and lamp, Miss Marple laid out her thoughts plainly. Mr. Hargreaves was not his real name. Mrs. Arkwell knew him as Philip Jameson. He had once lived in Devon. Something drove him to change his name and vanish. A woman came looking for him days before his death. No one saw them meet. He died from a single blow to the head. His hands were folded beneath him. Why? She stared at the list. Something tugged at the edge of her mind. Not a clue exactly, but a feeling. People rarely change their names unless the past is dangerous or the truth is unbearable. The question was not whether Mr. Hargreaves had enemies, but whether his old self had made them, and whether one of those enemies had finally found their way to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple closed the notebook and turned out the lamp, but her thoughts did not rest. Somewhere between identity and secrecy, between a crooked smile and a single blow, lay the beginning of something she had yet to see clearly, but she would. She always did. Chapter 4. Beneath the ivy at Little Hollows. The following morning brought a persistent drizzle that wrapped St. Mary Mead in a fine mist, softening the edges of roofs and hedgerows. The air held a hush, as if the village itself was reluctant to speak too loudly with death still lingering in its memory. Curtains fluttered only halfway open. Boots moved more softly on the cobbled lanes, and inside Little Hollows, the investigators resumed their quiet, careful work. Miss Marple, from her window, watched a figure in a dark mackintosh moving along the side of the property. Not Inspector Cray this time, but young Constable Graves, who, despite his fumbling manner, had a certain diligence she respected. He paused near the eastern wall of the house, where ivy grew thickest, running like green lace over the brick. He bent down, disappeared from view for a moment, then rose again and walked briskly round to the back of the property. Miss Marple made a mental note. Later that afternoon, after preparing a small basket of apple tarts for the vicar's convalescing niece, she made a short detour along the road that passed behind Little Hollows. Her steps, as always, were unhurried and entirely unremarkable, an elderly lady walking with the natural curiosity of someone long acquainted with her village. She stopped near the gate, feigning interest in a patch of dahlias in bloom just beyond the stone wall. Constable Graves, who had clearly not expected company, looked up in mild embarrassment. "Oh, Miss Marple, good afternoon." "Good afternoon, Constable," she said cheerfully. "You've been terribly busy. So much to sort out in such a small place." He gave a sheepish smile. "Yes, well, trying to be thorough, ma'am. Thought I'd check along the wall here. There's a broken section of ivy. Looks like someone may've been through this way recently." "Really? How observant of you." She stepped closer to peer over the low wall. The ground on the other side was muddied, but she could make out the vague impression of a heel print partially washed away, but distinct enough to suggest haste. "It's not Hargreaves's shoe size," Graves added. "I checked. Larger. He had very narrow feet, apparently. These prints came from someone heavier, judging by the depth." Miss Marple nodded. "Ivy can hide quite a bit, can't it? I once knew a gardener who said ivy was like people, it grows over things when you least want it to." Graves chuckled politely but didn't press further. Miss Marple left him to his search and resumed her walk, though her mind was already busily at work. A hidden approach, or perhaps an escape route. She recalled something else. When Mrs. Arkwell had arrived the previous day, her boots had shown fresh dirt along the sole edges, reddish, clay-heavy, not typical of London pavement, more like what might be found near the base of an old garden wall in the countryside. Was it possible Mrs. Arkwell had come to Little Hollows before anyone had seen her? That evening, Miss Marple hosted a small gathering for tea, a deliberate affair, designed not for comfort but for listening. Her guests included Mrs. Bantry, Miss Ellie Reed, and Dr. Haynes, the local physician who had examined the body. Strictly speaking, Dr. Haynes was saying, the blow could have been delivered with anything heavy. A rock, a bookend. It crushed the occipital bone, no signs of a struggle otherwise. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. And no defensive wounds? None. He didn't see it coming. That's what troubles me, said Ellie. He walked that same route every morning. Wouldn't he have heard someone behind him? Or seen them in the woods? Unless, Miss Marple said quietly, he wasn't walking. What if he had stopped, paused, perhaps to speak with someone? Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. You think he knew the person who killed him? I think, said Miss Marple, that a man who walks alone by habit does not stop unless something interrupts the routine, something familiar or unsettling. There was a short silence. Then Dr. Haynes added, there was one more thing. The oddest part, really. His jacket pocket contained a small photograph, quite old, black and white, of a little boy, maybe 5 or 6. No writing on the back, but worn around the edges, as if handled often. Was it shown to Mrs. Arkwell? Miss Marple asked. I believe so. She looked at it for a long time, then returned it without a word. The pieces were shifting again. A photograph of a child, a woman searching for a man who had changed his name, a private routine disrupted in the woods, and now a broken path through ivy, made by someone heavier than the victim. That night, Miss Marple took out her notebook again. This time she added 3 new entries. What was the child's relation to Hargreaves? Did Mrs. Arkwell recognize the boy or pretend not to? Who in the village would know the grounds of Little Hollows well enough to slip through unnoticed? She closed the notebook with a faint sigh. She was not yet ready to make any accusations, but something had shifted. The murder was no longer merely a question of who, it was now a question of why now. After so many years, what had returned to St. Mary Mead? Or perhaps more accurately, who had never truly left? As she set her lamp down and prepared for bed, the sound of distant thunder echoed across the fields. A storm was coming, yes, but Miss Marple suspected it had already begun. Quietly, in whispers and footprints and half-remembered names, and it would not pass until the final, hidden truth came out from under the ivy. Chapter 5. Threads of an old name. The next morning, the clouds had cleared, but the village still felt damp with unease. In St. Mary Mead, crimes had the curious effect of not just unsettling the present but tugging at old memories, like threads in a fraying tapestry. And now, with each passing day, more threads were being tugged. Miss Marple, unhurried as ever, made her way to the church library, a seldom used annex of St. Mary's Church that had once been the pride of the Ladies' Historical Committee. Few visited it now, save for the vicar, a handful of school children, and Miss Marple herself when something required gentle excavation. She was there for the electoral rolls. Inside the dim little room, dust motes drifted like lazy moths through the shafts of light. She opened the wooden file drawers until she found what she needed: parish rolls from the 1920s and early 30s. Carefully, she flipped through the brittle sheets. There, a name, Philip Jameson, listed at an address in Devon. 2 lines beneath it, Lydia Arkwell, spinster, marked at a separate address in the same village. So they had once lived near each other. That part of Mrs. Arkwell's story was true. But then Miss Marple found something else, another name, a familiar one. Arthur Symes, a gardener registered at the same Devon property where Mr. Jameson had once resided. That name had not been mentioned yet, but something about it stirred a vague recognition. She copied it down. When she stepped back outside, she found young Ellie Reed waiting beneath the old yew tree. I hoped I'd find you here, Ellie said. You've heard the latest, haven't you? "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said with a small smile. "What news?" "Inspector Craze just discovered that Mr. Hargreaves or Jameson, I suppose, had been writing letters. Found drafts in the desk at Little Hollows. Never sent, but addressed to someone called T.M." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, but her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her handbag. "How curious. Anything in the letters?" "Bits and pieces. Apologies mostly. Some reference to an old wrong. Regret about the child." Ellie paused, then added, "The letters were dated over several months. He must have been building up to something. Was there a return address?" "No, but Craze having handwriting compared, in case it matches anything else." Miss Marple nodded. "A man writing unsent letters often intends them as confession, or as proof," Ellie said. "In case something happens." The two women parted ways shortly afterward, but Miss Marple did not return home. Instead, she paid a call to Dr. Haynes, ostensibly to deliver a jar of marmalade, but in reality to ask a single question. "Do you happen to remember an Arthur Symes?" she asked as he examined the jar. Dr. Haynes looked mildly surprised. "Arthur Symes? Goodness, yes. He worked here in the village years ago. Groundsman at the old rectory before it was sold. Moved away suddenly, must have been 29 or 30. Did he have any family?" "None that I knew of. Kept to himself. Rough sort, but not unkind." "Why?" "I came across his name while researching something entirely unrelated," Miss Marple said, which was not entirely untrue. Curious how people vanish, and curious, indeed, how some did not vanish completely. Later that evening, back in her parlor, Miss Marple reopened her notebook. She added a new set of observations beneath her earlier questions. Arthur Symes worked near both Lydia and Philip in Devon. Mr. Hargreaves wrote letters. He never posted guilt about the child. The photograph found in his pocket might be connected. Was T.M. the child's initials? She stared at the name T.M. for a long while. Could it be the child's name? Or someone else, someone tied to the event that forced Jameson to vanish? It was around this time that the village, ever watchful, spotted a new development. A young man had arrived, staying at the inn. Tall, quiet, plainly dressed. Said he was a writer researching the countryside. Signed the guest book as Thomas March. Miss Marple, who had no particular faith in coincidences, found this interesting. Thomas March made polite appearances around the village, visiting the church, the post office, even stopping for a scone at Mrs. Goodbody's tea room. He asked few questions, but he listened very closely. On the third morning, he visited the cemetery. Miss Marple was there too. "Not by accident. You're admiring the Clemens family stone," she said gently as she joined him beneath the yew trees. March turned, a little startled. "Yes, the carving is meticulous. I always think grief leaves traces in the shape of letters," she said. "Are you here researching gravestones, Mr. March?" "Partly," he replied after a beat. "I'm looking into old village patterns, family migrations, that sort of thing. You're not from these parts?" "No," he admitted, "though my mother was, long ago." "I never knew her." Miss Marple tilted her head, reading far more in his tone than he likely intended. "It must be strange," she said softly, "to look for the past in a place that barely remembers itself." He glanced at her then. "Properly." "Yes, it is." She left him there and walked home slowly. It wasn't time yet, but the pieces were edging closer. Thomas March was not merely a curious visitor. His arrival so soon after the murder, after the woman's departure, after the photograph, could not be a coincidence. T.M. The initials returned to her mind again, and this time they carried weight. She didn't need to know everything. Not yet, but she knew what grief looked like, and Thomas March wore his grief not on his sleeve, but in the careful way he watched other people, as though every word might either open a wound or close one forever. That night, she wrote only 2 new lines in her notebook. Thomas March, TM equals the child? If so, what did he come looking for? Justice or revenge? The answer, Miss Marple knew, would determine everything. Chapter 6. A conversation by the Gateeth next morning broke cold and bright, the mist having given way to crisp sunlight that revealed every dew-slicked cobblestone and spider's web stretched. Between garden posts, St. Mary, Mead was beginning to lift its head again, though not without glancing nervously over its shoulder. Inside her drawing room, Miss Marple replaced her delicate breakfast tray on the windowsill and folded her hands in her lap. The air was cool enough for a shawl, and she had chosen a pale green one with scalloped edges, soft and unimposing, just as she liked to appear. But behind her calm eyes, her thoughts had sharpened like scissors. Thomas March. He had walked straight into the center of the mystery like a stone dropped in a still pond, and the ripples were beginning to reach the edges. She'd seen him again the evening before, speaking quietly with Ellie Reed outside the school gate. Their conversation had been brief, but March had looked tentative, as though unsure whether to ask something or reveal too much. Miss Marple had watched, unseen from her garden, and made a decision. By late morning, she stood near the gate of Little Hollows, knitting bags slung over one arm, a bundle of cinnamon buns wrapped in wax paper in the other. Constable Graves looked up at her approach and greeted her with a tired smile. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Bringing trouble to the crime scene?" "Only buns," she replied sweetly. "For you. You've been working so diligently." The constable blinked at the unexpected kindness, accepted the parcel with a boyish grin, and offered her a place on the low stone bench just beyond the garden wall. "Not much to see now," he said between bites. "Inspector Cray's gone back to the station. Said he'd call when there's more from London. Fingerprints, handwriting, the usual." And as the house yielded anything new, Graves shook his head. "Just a lot of dust and books. Whoever Mr. Hargreaves was, he didn't live like a man with a past. Bare walls, no photographs except that one of the boy." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "And you're quite sure no one's claimed the photograph?" "No. And the woman, Mrs. Arkwell, she didn't identify it either. But she stared at it a long time." Miss Marple hesitated, then asked, "Have you met our new visitor, Mr. March?" Graves straightened. "Yes, seemed polite enough. Quiet. Said he was writing something about rural graveyards." "Did he mention his mother?" Graves blinked. No, he didn't. Should he have?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said gently. "But if he's the child in that photograph, it might explain a few things." The constable's face changed. "You think he's come here because of the murder?" "I think," she said, "that he may have come before the murder, or at least in pursuit of something only partly related to it." Graves frowned. "You mean revenge?" "I don't know yet, but it would be wise to remember that murder is rarely about what happens in the moment. It is almost always the result of something much older. A seed sown in silence, watered with shame." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage, not for the vicar this time, but for his wife, Griselda, who, despite her scatterbrained reputation, possessed a remarkably accurate sense of people's true characters, even if she couldn't always put it into words. "I've met the March boy," Griselda said, setting down a mismatched cup of Earl Grey. "There's sadness in him, Jane, but not the dangerous sort. More like confusion." "Did he ask questions?" "Not many, but he listened very intently when I told him about the village, its past, the house at Little Hollows. He even asked whether any of the old staff were still alive." "Staff?" "Yes, you remember, the old matron who kept house there when it was a children's retreat. This was decades ago, mind." Miss Marple's brow lifted. "Children's retreat? Oh yes, only briefly. In the early 1930s, it was run by a private trust for children whose families had complicated situations. That's how the vicar put it. One of those vague cusses meant to soothe guilt with good intentions. And did Mr. Hargreaves Philip Jameson work there? Griselda frowned. I don't know, but it might explain the photograph. Miss Marple walked back slowly through the village, her mind spinning in quiet, careful loops. A retreat for displaced children, a photograph of a boy, a man who changed his name, a woman who came searching for him after 30 years. And now, that very child grown standing among the gravestones, not with vengeance, but with yearning. That evening, as twilight settled, Miss Marple found Thomas March again. He was sitting alone on a bench outside the tea room, a journal open on his lap, though he wasn't writing. His eyes were far off. She approached quietly. Forgive me, Mr. March. I hope I'm not disturbing you. He looked up, surprised but not displeased. Not at all, Miss Marple. She sat beside him. The moment hung gently, without urgency. I believe you may be the child in the photograph found on Mr. Hargreaves, she said softly. March didn't answer for a long time. Then, yes, I think I am. You think? I don't know for certain. I never knew my parents. I was raised in institutions. But when I saw his name Philip Jameson in a newspaper a year ago, something resonated. I don't know why. I've had this photograph my whole life. No writing on the back, just the image. When the name came up again in connection to Devon, I came looking. Miss Marple studied him. Did you ever meet him? No, I tried, once. I thought perhaps he'd know something, but I never got the courage. And now he looked away. I'm sorry, she said. I'm not, he replied after a moment. I think I came here because I needed to see the place, to know if he was the man I feared he was, or the one I hoped he might be. Miss Marple stood, her hands folded over her bag. Sometimes, she said gently, a photograph survives because someone couldn't bear to let it go. And sometimes, it's kept because it's the only proof a heart ever felt remorse. He looked at her then, properly, as if seeing something he'd not expected. She nodded once, then turned and left him there in the cooling dusk, with only the sound of closing shutters and the distant bells from the church to keep him company. The question now was not just, who killed Philip Jameson? It was what secret had bound him to a child he never claimed, and whether that secret had been enough to cost him his life. Chapter 7. Whispers at the Flower Show. The annual St. Mary Mead Summer Flower Show took place just 2 days later, and it unfolded with all the usual pomp and powdered gloves, as if the village had collectively agreed not to let a murder soil the begonias. Tables were laid with starched white linen, and ribbons fluttered in the breeze above arrangements of delphiniums, dahlias, and particularly vicious peonies, which had become something of a battleground between Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Ridgway over the years. Miss Marple, of course, attended dressed in a soft blue cardigan and hat with a forget-me-not pin, her presence as unobtrusive as ever. But she was not looking at the flowers. She was watching faces. Grief and guilt often left marks, but it was fear that truly betrayed people. A stiff posture, a glance held too long, a smile delayed by half a second. Miss Marple had learned long ago that murder did not only take a life, it disturbed the lives around it like a dropped stone in a birdbath. She caught sight of Ellie Reed near the refreshments table, standing stiffly beside a modest display of sweet peas. The school teacher's usual cheer had given way to something more reserved. Miss Marple approached her slowly. Your sweet peas are lovely, my dear, she said. Ellie smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. They're not as dramatic as Mrs. Price Ridley's carnations, but they don't smell like nail polish remover either. Miss Marple chuckled, then leaned slightly closer. You've been quiet lately. Ellie hesitated. I've just been thinking about Mr. Hargreaves. Ellie blinked, then nodded. Yes, but more about Thomas March, really. He asked me if I knew anyone who worked at Little Hollows during the time it was a retreat. I didn't, But then I remembered something strange. What sort of strange? Well, it was before I was born, but my mother used to talk about a woman named Agnes Filbury. She'd been the housekeeper at Little Hollows, left suddenly after the home closed. No one quite knew why. Moved to a cottage near East Wellings, I think. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. That is strange. Why would a housekeeper vanish when the house was no longer in use? I wondered that, too, Ellie said. And then I remembered what you said, that murder doesn't start when someone dies. Sometimes it starts when they leave. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Agnes Filbury. It was a name that hadn't appeared on any list, hadn't been mentioned by the inspector. It smelled of dust and buried things. Back at the awards table, the judges were announcing Mrs. Bantry as the runner-up for Best Arrangement. In a blue vase, an outcome she received with theatrical grace and barely concealed triumph. Miss Marple used the distraction to excuse herself. By late afternoon, she had made her way to the public telephone kiosk at the edge of the village. After 2 calls and the patient application of her rather aged address book, she found what she needed. Agnes Filbury now lived under her maiden name, Agnes Welcome, and resided in a small flat above a cobbler's shop in East Wellings. Alone, retired, and reputed to be sharp as vinegar. Miss Marple arranged for a car the next morning. The drive was unremarkable, though the fields were beginning to yellow with the late summer sun, and crows seemed more numerous than usual on the fences. She arrived just before noon. The cobbler's wife directed her upstairs, warning with a roll of the eyes. She's not fond of visitors. Miss Marple smiled. Neither am I, unless they bring gossip. I believe we'll get along fine. Agnes Welcome was a woman of 70 or so, square of frame and jaw, with wisps of iron-gray hair escaping her bun. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, swept over Miss Marple like a broom over a dusty floor. I've not been back to Little Hollows since '34, she said, after Miss Marple introduced herself and offered no false pretenses. I understand. Miss Marple replied, some places are better left behind, but some wrongs, I think, never fully leave us. Agnes snorted. If this is about Philip Jameson, you're too late. I read it in the papers. Good riddance. That's a strong sentiment. He was a coward, she said flatly, and a liar, and the worst kind of man, one who let others carry the consequences of his mistakes. Miss Marple waited. Silence was a tool as sharp as any scalpel. Eventually, Agnes continued, there was a boy, 5 years old, came to us under a false name. No family visited, but Jameson Miss Marple used the distraction to excuse herself. By late afternoon, she had made her way to the public telephone kiosk at the edge of the village. After 2 calls and the patient application of her rather aged address book, she found what she needed. Agnes Filbury now lived under her maiden name, Agnes Welcome, and resided in a small flat above a cobbler's shop in East Wellings. Alone, retired, and reputed to be sharp as vinegar. Miss Marple arranged for a car the next morning. The drive was unremarkable, though the fields were beginning to yellow with the late summer sun, and crows seemed more numerous than usual on the fences. She arrived just before noon. The cobbler's wife directed her upstairs, warning with a roll of the eyes. She's not fond of visitors. Miss Marple smiled. Neither am I, unless they bring gossip. I believe we'll get along fine. Agnes Welcome was a woman of 70 or so, square of frame and jaw, with wisps of iron-gray hair escaping her bun. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, swept over Miss Marple like a broom over a dusty floor. I've not been back to Little Hollows since '34, she said, after Miss Marple introduced herself and offered no false pretenses. I understand. Miss Marple replied, some places are better left behind, but some wrongs, I think, never fully leave us. Agnes snorted. If this is about Philip Jameson, you're too late. I read it in the papers. Good riddance. That's a strong sentiment. He was a coward, she said flatly, and a liar, and the worst kind of man, one who let others carry the consequences of his mistakes. Miss Marple waited. Silence was a tool as sharp as any scalpel. Eventually, Agnes continued. There was a boy, 5 years old, came to us under a false name. No family visited, but Jameson, we called him that, then he would check on him often. Always pretended it was duty, but you could see it, something weighed on him. And what happened to the boy? Gone one night. Vanished. Jameson said the records were misfiled, that the child had been transferred. But I knew something wasn't right. Did you ask questions? I did, Agnes said quietly, and I was dismissed 3 weeks later. Paid off, told to sign a silence agreement or risk legal action. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. And the boy was never found? Agnes's lips pressed into a hard line. No, but someone buried something in the garden that year. I saw it. One night, late, a shape, wrapped in cloth. Gone by morning. The room went very still. Miss Marple's voice was nearly a whisper. Do you believe that child died there? I believe someone wanted me to think he hadn't, Agnes said. And I believe Jameson lived the rest of his life afraid that someone might remember. Miss Marple stood and gently took the woman's hand. Thank you, she said. You've remembered far more than most would dare. Back in St. Mary Mead, the sun had set and the flower show had ended with clinking teacups and the rustle of folded tables. But the peace was only skin deep. Miss Marple knew now. This crime had not been born in the present. It had come walking out of the past like a ghost that refused to stay buried. And somewhere, she thought, someone else remembered that boy too. Not just Thomas March. Someone who had feared the truth enough to kill for it. Chapter 8. The garden that wasn't quiet. Next morning arrived with a wind sharper than expected, as if the late summer air carried something uneasy along with the scent of cut grass and cooling stone. The people of St. Mary Mead went about their business as usual, though usual had begun to shift. Conversations were shorter, smiles were tighter, and the name Philip Jameson, once a whisper, then a curiosity, was now a shadow stretching across every doorstep. At the Rosewood Inn, Thomas March sat alone at a corner table with a cup of tea gone cold. He wasn't writing, though his notebook was open. He was staring out the window, where a single gardener in overalls trimmed back the hedgerows behind the stable. March had barely touched his food since the day of the flower show. His appetite seemed to have disappeared the moment his past began slipping into view. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had returned from her visit to East Wellings with more than memories. She had returned with certainty, quiet, terrible certainty that a long-buried truth was beginning to surface. And now, if she moved carefully, the shape of that truth would finally be clear enough to catch in daylight. She called on Inspector Cray just after noon, arriving at the temporary office set up inside the town hall's back room. She brought shortbread, not out of flattery, but because shortbread made people slower to interrupt, I think. She said after pouring tea into two chipped mugs, that your case may not begin with Mr. Hargreaves at all. Cray leaned back, skeptical. You mean with Philip Jameson? Not even with him, Miss Marple said, but with a child that disappeared nearly 30 years ago from a place he was never supposed to be. She told him about Agnes Filbury, now well command what she had witnessed. The burial, the silence, the abrupt dismissal. Cray paled slightly. You're telling me there may have been a child murdered in the Garden of Little Hollows, and no one ever investigated? Because no one ever reported the child missing, she replied. And because the records, I suspect, were doctored or removed entirely. And you believe Jameson was responsible. I believe he felt responsible. And someone else feared that his guilt would finally give way to confession. Cray folded his arms. So someone silenced him before he could speak. Yes, but it's not enough to know who might have done it. We must ask who would have had reason to fear not only exposure but judgment. Someone who was still here, still watching. Cray's brow furrowed. You think the killer is local? Miss Marple gave a small nod. The burial wasn't done in haste. Agnes said it was deliberate. That suggests knowledge of the grounds, and confidence no one would find it. The inspector didn't speak for a long while. Then, if there is a body still on the property, or evidence of one, we'll need to get clearance to search. Miss Marple sipped her tea. I rather think the person responsible may get nervous before you do. That evening, the garden at Little Hollows stood quiet again but not untouched. Constable Graves, who had resumed his post along the perimeter, reported that someone had moved one of the paving stones near the edge of the garden path. A small detail, easily dismissed, unless, of course, you were Miss Marple. At dawn the next morning, she returned to the property, this time not as a visitor, but with purpose. Graves let her in without argument. He had begun to trust her instincts, even if they came in the shape of questions rather than statements. Show me, she said simply. He led her to the edge of the garden where the ivy grew thick along the base of the old shed. There, beneath a low branch, a circular paving stone had been lifted slightly out of place. The dirt underneath it was freshly disturbed. No footprints, Graves murmured. It was done carefully. Gloves, I imagine. Miss Marple crouched slowly, brushing her hand over the rim of the stone. It's not what they did that interests me, she said, but what they hoped to prevent. Graves looked puzzled. Someone thought this was the burial spot, she continued, but they were wrong. That's the real clue. She stood and turned toward the center of the garden, the old rose beds, untended now, tangled with roots and thick with age. The scent of the soil was richer there, not from years of fertilizer, but from the quiet presence of memory. Have someone dig there, she said, near the base of the climbing rose. Gently, Graves did as she asked. Within an hour. Chapter 9. A name in the ledger. The morning after the discovery at Little Hollows. Broken solemn silence. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. The village of St. Mary Mead, though outwardly unchanged, carried a tension now that didn't lift with the mist. Curtains fluttered less freely. Doors were closed with more care. Conversations, when they happened, were low and clipped, punctuated by glances toward the house that had become a reluctant grave. The child's remains had been removed respectfully. Forensic experts were still at work, but early reports confirmed what Miss Marple had already intuited. The body had been buried nearly 3 decades ago. No signs of trauma on the bones. No clothing remained, save for a few rusted buttons and the fragment of the linen wrapping. But tucked deeper in the earth, near the skeletal hand, they had found something unexpected, a small lead disc, stamped crudely with the letters T.J. Miss Marple, who had been present at the edge of the garden during the final stages of the dig, took the disc in her gloved hand and examined it with care. Tag from a boarding home. Dr. Haynes guessed. They used to mark clothing that way. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Orphanages, children's retreats, a way to keep track when no one else bothered to. She handed it back gently. It would appear this child had a name, or part of one. T.J., murmured Inspector Cray. Could be a match to Thomas March. No, Miss Marple said firmly. Thomas March was never that child, but perhaps he shared something with him more than a resemblance, such as a past shaped by the same people. That afternoon, while Cray waited on identification records from county authorities, Miss Marple returned to the church annex, not to search the electoral rolls this time, but the ledgers kept by the late Reverend Whittington Clement's predecessor, who had been vicar during the brief period when Little Hollows operated as a children's home. The ledgers were meticulous. Reverend Whittington had been a man of routine, and his records reflected the strict order of his life. Baptisms, donations, school placements, and odd pastoral visits all itemized by date and name. Miss Marple ran her finger down one particular page dated September 1932. Visit requested by P. Jameson. Inquiry about baptismal certificate for child. Timothy Jameson. No parents listed. Requested duplicate under privacy seal. Miss Marple sat back. Timothy Jameson, she murmured. TJ. She scanned the next few entries. No adoption, no transfer. Just silence. The next record that mentioned Little Hollows came 3 weeks later. Report from housekeeper. AF of unauthorized nighttime digging behind the east garden wall. Grounds checked, nothing found. So Agnes had tried to raise the alarm even then. Miss Marple replaced the ledger gently and stepped out into the quiet air. The sun was breaking through now, casting gold onto the church's aging stonework, but she felt none of its warmth. Timothy Jameson, buried with a tin soldier and no voice to speak for him. A child hidden by silence, protected by shame, and now finally named. She walked home slowly, but not aimlessly. There was one last question left unanswered. Who knew? Not just about the boy, but about the burial, about Philip Jameson's guilt, about the potential for exposure. She sat at her writing desk and laid out 3 names. Lydia Arkwell, who came searching, not accusing. Agnes Filbury, who was silenced, not complicit. Someone else, still present, still afraid. Her eyes fell on the edge of her notebook, where she'd once scribbled a name she hadn't thought relevant until now. Arthur Symes, the old groundsman, dismissed quietly from the Devon home after the scandal. Name never mentioned again. She found the reference from Devon's parish employment records, tracked via the same ledger archives she'd visited last week. But there, in fine ink, was the final link. Arthur Symes, relocated to St. Mary Mead, employed as gardener at Little Hollows, 1933-1936. He had followed the house, or perhaps, more chillingly, he had been brought along by someone who trusted him to maintain silence. But there had been no mention of him in recent years, no presence in the village records, no grave, no forwarding address, unless she opened the most recent church newsletters. One name leapt from the page, Albert Simmons, the butcher, but 20 years ago. When he first arrived, he had been listed as Arthur Simmons, formerly of Devonshire. Names changed easily in those days, and Miss Marple had always thought there was something forced about the cheer in his voice, something too precise about the way he remembered nothing when asked about the history of the house. He now walked past daily. If Albert Simmons and Arthur Symes were the same man, then someone with first-hand knowledge of the burial and a reason to fear Jameson's letters had been hiding in plain sight. By nightfall, she had written a note and sent it by hand to Inspector Cray. I believe your murderer may not have killed out of hatred, but out of fear of being seen, after so many years, for what they were. Speak to Albert Simmons. He was never meant to grow old in this village, and someone else's ghost came back to remind him. Then, calmly, Miss Marple folded her shawl, lit her lamp, and took up her knitting. The click of her needles filled the room as the church bell rang in the hour. The pieces were all on the board now, and the killer who had once buried a secret in the earth was about to find there were some things even deeper than soil. Chapter 10. Miss Marple ties the final thread. The following afternoon, the vicarage drawing room was quiet, warm, and softly lit by a shaft of late sun slanting in through the lace curtains. It was the kind of room meant for lemon cake and gentle conversation, not confrontation. But Miss Marple, seated with her hands folded neatly in her lap, had never required dramatic backdrops. She found the truth revealed itself more fully over tea than under interrogation lamps. Inspector Cray sat opposite her, head on the table, face tense but composed. To his right sat Thomas March, pale but steady, and beside him, Ellie Reed, who had insisted on being present not for curiosity, but conscience. The vicar hovered nearby, uneasy but quiet. while Constable Graves stood at the door, with an expression that suggested something significant was about to unfold. Then the door opened. Albert Simmons stepped in. His white apron had been replaced with a pressed brown coat. He smiled with polite confusion, wiping his palms on a handkerchief. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I came as asked, though I must say I'm a bit puzzled." Miss Marple rose gently, gesturing to the chair set aside. "Please, Mr. Simmons, do sit." He hesitated, then complied. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to tighten the air. Then Miss Marple spoke. "Albert Simmons is your name now," she said gently. "But 30 years ago, you were Arthur Syme's groundskeeper at a private children's home in Devon, and later here, at Little Hollows. Isn't that so?" The butcher shifted slightly. "You've made a mistake, Miss Marple. I've lived in St. Mary Mead all my adult life." "No," she said softly. "You've survived here. You've existed carefully, invisibly, but not without history, and not without fear." Cray interjected. "We've found employment records from Devon, handwriting matches, so do the dates, and we've confirmed a transfer of wages to a new identity, Albert Simmons, around the same time as the closure of the home." Simmons stiffened. "That doesn't make me a killer." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but it does make you a man who carried a terrible secret, one Philip Jameson had hoped would stay buried." Thomas March leaned forward. "You knew the boy Timothy Jameson, didn't you?" Simmons said nothing. Miss Marple continued. "When the child died, it wasn't murder. I believe it was illness, perhaps an untreated fever. Something tragic, but not criminal. Jameson panicked. He feared scandal, exposure, perhaps even prosecution for negligence. And you, loyal, frightened, you helped bury the child, didn't you?" Simmons's mouth twitched, and for the first time, tears welled in his eyes. "I didn't want to. I told him we should tell the authorities, but he said it would destroy the home, destroy him. He made me promise. I buried him by the roses. I prayed over it. I told myself it was kindness." Ellie Reed whispered, "Then why kill him all these years later?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "Because guilt is bearable until someone threatens to share it." Philip Jameson had begun writing letters, drafting confessions. The return of Thomas March's resemblance to Timothy must have shattered the illusion of safety. "You believed the boy had come back from the grave, didn't you?" Simmons nodded slowly, tears spilling now. "He looked like him. Same eyes, I thought. I thought maybe God had sent him back to finish it." "You followed Jameson into the woods that morning," Cray said, his tone firmer now. "You struck him from behind with the spade you'd once used to bury the boy. That's what the forensics suggest. And the bruise matches." Simmons didn't deny it. "I didn't plan to," he said hoarsely. "I only meant to confront him. But he was calm to calm. He said he was going to tell the truth, said the world had changed, that he had changed. And all I could see was everything falling apart again. I thought if he told, I'd be blamed too. I'd lose everything. So He broke off, burying his face in his hands. Silence followed. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, then said, with a sadness that cut deeper than judgment, "You killed him to preserve a lie that was already crumbling. And in doing so, you took from him the very thing he was trying to restore, a chance at redemption." Cray rose. "Albert Simmons, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Philip Jameson." As Graves approached and gently took the man by the arm, Simmons did not resist. He looked at Thomas March once, then turned away when the door closed behind them. Miss Marple remained standing, her hands folded. The room seemed quieter now, as if the truth itself had exhaled. Thomas broke the silence. "So I wasn't the child." "No," Miss Marple said gently, "but you were the echo. And sometimes echoes are what awaken the past." He looked down. "I still don't know who I am." Miss Marple placed a hand on his arm. "Perhaps not yet, But now no part of you is buried. Outside, the evening light was beginning to stretch across the village rooftops. The roses at Little Hollows stood freshly pruned, and beneath them, the earth was still and clean. For the first time in decades, St. Mary Mead slept that night with one less secret, and Miss Marple, seated by her window with her knitting in her lap and the hush of the village all round, allowed herself the quiet satisfaction of truth having, once again, found its way home.